Welcome back to part 3. We are talking about the QRI-5, the qualitative reading inventory that you will be giving this week. Before we jump into that, I wanted to share an article with you that I recently read in the Marshall Memo, which actually was summarizing an article by Juliet Halliday in the Reading Teacher in September 2012, and it discussed 4 faulty assumptions about reading levels, and I thought this was interesting. Assumption number 1 is that decoding accuracy and reading comprehension go hand in hand. Well, that is a faulty assumption because just because a student is good at decoding doesn't mean they are comprehending to an equal level, and vice versa, because they're comprehending may not mean that they can decode. So the implication with that is that you should be on the lookout for disparities in reading. The next faulty assumption is that independent reading requires near perfect decoding accuracy. And she talked a lot about how the threshold for independent reading is typically 98 or 99%. However, is this reasonable to expect them to read aloud with near perfect accuracy? And how important is that for independent reading? So definitely want to take into account whether or not the errors change the meaning of the text, because then it will impede the comprehension. But basically, her argument is that error-free reading isn't essential for building a love of reading. The next faulty assumption is that oral reading skill is a reasonable proxy for silent reading skill. And that is not necessarily the case, because having an audience can make a difference, which is why the QRI assesses both oral and silent reading. So you should assess both, because there can be a difference, especially if there is a time pressure or a teacher sitting there with a stopwatch. Um, there is a difference between oral and silent reading. And the last faulty assumption was that decoding and comprehension difficulty cause frustration. And she pointed out, Halliday, that very little research exists to support the connection between frustration level and actual emotional frustration. One study in particular found that students became frustrated only when they reached 41.5% comprehension and 90% accuracy. And many students enjoy reading texts that are challenging. So the implication there is don't assume a challenging text will be frustrating. All right, so just wanted to share some current research with you from the Reading Teacher, which is an excellent journal to subscribe to if you are looking for something of that nature. All right, let's talk about the QRI. There are 3 main purposes. The first being to determine the student's independent instructional and or frustration level. It's probably not very helpful to know what their frustration level is. More or less, we want to know their independent level and their instructional level, so we can match text to their needs. Second, it helps us assess the student's ability to read different types of texts. Again, we're looking at narrative and expository, and it's interesting because typically there is a disparity between their performance on either of those. And lastly, it helps us to assess the student's ability to comprehend in different modes. So again, it helps you can do it as listening. You could do a listening comprehension variation. You could have the student read it silently. You could have them do oral reading. You can use those different modes. So I recommend you take a minute now to mark with a post-it pages 38 and 39, which contains the script for each component of the QRI-5. So as I review your video footage, I will be looking for you using the script, which you'll see that I used in my sample video. And it also tells you what materials you need to have ready, which are student copies, examiner copies, a clipboard, pencils, a stopwatch, and an audio recorder. So those are helpful pages to look at and have in front of you, because it does contain the required script. All right, word lists were discussed in Chapter 6, which should have been administered in your 4th practicum session. You want to begin with the word list 2 or more years below the student's chronological grade. And these word lists are great. They give you a quick estimate of their word identification skill and help you determine where to start with passages. However, note that word identification in isolation is a rough predictor of the level of a passage that the student can read and comprehend. It's not the end-all, be-all, and it lacks authenticity, being that the words are in isolation. So scoring the word list, you just count up those that are automatically identified. The total number correct will tell you what passage level to start with to assess the child's independent reading level. Whatever list you start at, you go up or down. And then you want to start with the passage at the student's independent level and then go up until you reach their instructional level. So again, here are my lists. She scored independent on pre-primer 2-3. And then instructional on primer and frustration on first grade. So when I give her the passages, I'm going to start with the pre-primer passage and see how she does, and then I'm going to give her the primer level passage and see how she does. So always start with the word list that you found to be their independent level. So again, where do I start? Start with a passage that corresponds to the highest independent level attained on the word list. For example, if they are independent on first grade, independent on second grade, instructional on third grade, and frustration on fourth grade, what level passage would you start with? What do you think? You would start with the level 2 passage because that is the highest level that they were independent. So you want to give the level 2 passage, see how it goes. If they are truly independent at that level, then go up to third grade and see how they do. All right, so the QRI helps you in assessing prior knowledge in 2 ways. First, via the concept questions. So you're going to want to take a look at those. The way you score them is they get 3 points for a precise definition or specific answer, 2 points if they give an example, 1 point for general association, and 0 points if they have no response or don't know. So typically there's 3 or 4 concept questions about what the topic is, and then you can use those to activate schema and see how much familiarity the student has. So with those, you want to look for a score of 55% or better. Then the second way it assesses prior knowledge is using predictions, and the script you use for that is, given that the title is blank and it includes the concepts of blank, blank, and blank, what do you think the passage will be about? You want to look for 2+ idea statements that sum up many of the main ideas contained in the selection. So my student only gave 1 main idea statement, didn't have the most detailed prediction. This would be a skill for her to work on. All right, if they have prior knowledge, you should continue. Again, prior knowledge is 55% familiarity or plus. You want to introduce the passage per the script. You want to time the student as they read the passage. You want to code their reading of the passage. Afterwards, you want to remove the passage and have them retell as many details as possible. And then after they have retold everything they remember, you're going to ask the questions at the end, with or without the look backs. All right, so let's talk about, I'm going to go ahead and jump into part 4. Let's talk about how you are going to record the reading behaviors. So given that we did the running record homework, you should be pretty good at this by now, but also check out pages 60 and 61 to see. Substitutions, you just write what the student said above the target word. Omissions, you circle the omitted word. Insertions, use the caret and write down the word. Self-corrections, write the miscue and then mark it with a C. A lot of times I use SC for self-correct. Reversals, you would mark with that sigmoidal curve symbol. Very rarely do I see reversals. Punctuation ignored, you would X out what was ignored. And then any miscues that change the meaning, you would mark MC for meaning changing. So these convention marks vary slightly from the traditional running record conventions. And if a student is unable to identify a word, gently ask him or her to skip it and move on. Repetitions and hesitations are not counted as errors. All right, so again, this is from your book. You can take a look and see how they coded this. So it looks like there was a substitution here. Where is my pointer? Substitution with what there? And that would be meaning changing. So that's one meaning changing miscue. Next we have went instead of were. That was another meaning changing miscue. So you get the idea, and I think you're relatively strong in this area given all the work we've been doing on running records. All right, let's talk about total accuracy versus total acceptability. These are very important terms to know and to know how they differ. So total accuracy is all the miscues are counted, and then using those the level is determined. So the miscues counted are insertions, omissions, substitutions, reversals, self-corrections are included in accuracy as well. So when you are calculating total accuracy, you need to include self-corrections. Now, total acceptability is only meaning changing miscues are counted for the level determination, and we'll talk about what constitutes a meaning changing miscue in a minute. So the miscues counted for acceptability change the meaning and are syntactically changing the meaning, semantically changing the meaning, and are not self-corrected. So special cases in total accuracy, remember total accuracy are all errors. Miscues on proper names, so it's counted as one miscue even if it's repeated, if the pronunciation doesn't change. So let's say they say Maria for Mary. Every time there's Mary in there, that would only count as one miscue. If the pronunciation does change, it counts as a miscue for each pronunciation change. So maybe they say Maria, they say Mari. Every time they're changing the pronunciation, it counts as a miscue each time. For miscues on the same word, it's counted as one miscue if it doesn't change the meaning of the passage, even if it's repeated, if the pronunciation doesn't change. So if they say pup for puppy every single time, if it doesn't change the meaning of the passage, it wouldn't be counted. And then if pronunciation changes, it does count as a miscue for each pronunciation change. More special cases in total accuracy, omitting an entire line. This counts as one miscue. So omission represents a loss of place, not a conscious omission due to inability to decode. So if they skip an entire line, it's only counted as one miscue, not a miscue for every word in the line. Total accuracy. So in order to determine their level using accuracy, they need to have a 98% or higher for accuracy to be independent. They need to be between 90 and 97% accuracy for instructional, and anything less than 90% is at their frustration level. So again, this is for total accuracy, looking at all of their miscues, including their self-corrections. If they have 98% or higher accuracy, it's independent, 90 to 97 instructional, and then 90 or lower is frustrational level. And you should be very skilled at calculating the accuracy percentage, since that was also part of your recent homework, and many folks actually did that on their assignment. All right, I'm going to stop there, and then we're going to dive in talking about acceptable miscues and total acceptability and how it differs from total accuracy.